Hello and a very warm welcome to Talking Europe. Well, March is supposed to be the month that British Prime Minister Theresa May triggers Article 50, beginning the official withdrawal process of the UK from the EU. The EU, however, says the UK will have to reach a financial settlement first before any substantive negotiations on a future relationship or trade deals can begin. And the sum EU officials are expected to look for is thought to be around €60 billion, payment, they say, for commitments the UK has already made. May has insisted multiple times that the UK will be looking for a hard Brexit, opting out of the single market. But is that what the British people voted for? And where does that leave EU citizens in the UK and vice versa? Once the UK triggers Article 50, 2 years of talks with the EU begins. But what happens at the end of that? If there's no deal, does the UK leave with nothing? Feeling a little lost as to how things are going and might proceed? Well, you're not alone. To help us see clearer, I'm joined by Mr. Alan Smith from the Scottish National Party. You sit, of course, with the Greens here in Europe. Across the table, I have MEP for Germany, Mr. Jakob van Weizsäcker. You're with the Social Democrats. And beside you, I have British MEP, Mr. Charles Tannock. You're with the Conservative Party in the UK and sit with the European Conservatives and Reformists here in Parliament. Mr. Tannock, can I start with your good self? Do you think this Article 50 is actually going to be triggered in March? What's the delay?
Well, obviously, there is a delay in the House of Lords. There's some ping-ponging going on, but I suspect that it'll all be resolved by the middle of March, and it will be triggered in the last week or so of March. I don't see anything which can stop that happening now. And then there'll be the 2-year clock ticking away, in which Mrs May has made it very clear in the government white paper that we will not be seeking to remain members of the single market or the customs union. We're going for a hard Brexit, a bespoke deal. I have to say I'm not very optimistic because, as you said, there will be this huge divorce bill demanded. I think that's probably an exaggerated figure, the 60 billion. I think it's more like 35, 40. But Theresa May has said that she will pay a reasonable amount, but I don't think that the backbench Conservative MPs will accept a figure even remotely close to that. So I am very, very pessimistic, sadly. I wish I could say something different. I argued strongly for a soft Brexit and for the European Economic Area and EFTA to be rejoined and to have a Norway-type model, but I'm afraid that's been rejected.
Mr. Smith, how concerned are you? I mean, given that the ball is really in the EU's court when that Article 50 is triggered. There's a 2-year deadline. And if no deal has been made, the EU can tell the UK to leave with nothing. I mean, and given that this financial settlement seems to be top of the agenda for the 27 in the EU side, I mean, we could spend 2 years negotiating that.
All things are possible. I share Charles's pessimism, I have to say. I think we have a UK government that must be saved from itself. The vote was only 52% across the whole of the UK. The UK is not one bloc, it's a complicated series of places. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Gibraltar, the sovereign bases on Cyprus, the Welsh position, the position of the London authorities as well. We have a lively dynamic within the UK that must be assisted by the European Union. And as soon as Article 50 is triggered, and I agree, I think it's sooner rather than later, but what Mrs May wants is only a tiny part of this discussion, because 27 is a bigger number than 1. And what I'm concerned about is that we have seen a narrative developing amongst the Brexiteers, the lunatics who are presently in charge of the asylum, that they've turned the boat towards the rocks and they're trying to say that the rocks are out to get us. If we want to leave the club, there are consequences.
Mr. van Weizsäcker, how do you think the other 27 in the EU will proceed with these talks? For now, it seems quite a united front, saying, they can't give in to everything the UK demands. They're afraid of this knock-on effect that other countries could start to leave the Union. How tough do you think the rest of the EU is going to be?
I don't think I would want a hard Brexit, but I think given where we are, we need to strive for clean Brexit. And so what that entails is a clean financial settlement, a clean set of rules where we want to end up, and I think also within the 2 years, very good answers to the millions of people either from Europe living in the UK today and the millions of people living in the EU and what will remain the EU from the UK. And I think that's the agenda for now. And then once we've settled these issues, we will, of course, need to talk about a reasonable transition arrangements. And I think that's very important as well, because if we don't get that...
She's rejected that as well. She said she does want short-term implementing measures, not a transitional agreement. And I also deeply regret the idea that the EU citizens, 3.6 million living in the United Kingdom, are being described by some quarters, not the official line from the government, but a particular minister, as the best negotiating asset, i.e. a bargaining chip. I don't accept that human beings are bargaining chips in the negotiations.
How do you see it, Mr. Weizsäcker? Do you think that, in a way, they're right? Because because indeed there's 3.6 million EU citizens in the UK. The rest of the EU very concerned about that, and indeed the market of the UK. Is that a good bargaining chip that May has? Will that get others to
It must
consider?
never be considered as such.
I wouldn't consider them as such at all. That's why I said both negotiating a clean Brexit and making certain that these people don't have to, and we're talking about millions of people. There are also around 1.5 million people from the UK living in the EU. They need assurances, and they need them soon, because they've built their lives on very different assumptions.
Who's going to move first?
In good
Mr.
faith.
Smith.
I'm receiving emails, I'm sure Charles is as well, on a daily basis that would break your heart.
There's a lot of EU citizens already leaving the UK out because they feel like second class citizens.
Well, they're having their applications for residence. My wife has just gone through the process. It's an 85-page document, 50 pages of evidence I've had to submit, my passport and hers locked up for 6 months, a large fee to get the residence certificate. And that's even before you can hope to apply for the British passport.
So what should be done for these EU citizens? Should the UK then just say...
Well, there were attempts in the House of Lords and even in the House of Commons to vote to immediately declare their absolute right to remain for all those who were there, particularly those who were there before the Brexit referendum with a cut-off date of June the 23rd. The government has repeatedly vetoed that, whipped against it. There's been an amendment in the House of Lords which got through, but I'm afraid the Labour Party, voted against it as well. I mean, the Labour Party is voting very strongly now for the Brexit solution as well. We haven't, the whole issue.
The EU citizens
are caught up in all this debate, and it's totally unfair because they came to Britain, 98% work and pay their taxes. They came there legally within their treaty rights, and now we're saying that those are all up for negotiation.
And of course, I imagine this block on the EU citizens is because one of the main reasons for the Brexit was to halt immigration to the UK. I mean, imagine going through the future, there will be inspiration taken from a variety of models that are already in place with people outside of the EU working with the EU. For example, Norway. We've heard Theresa May say she wants a made-to-measure based on other models. Well, we sent our reporter Annie Gerhard to Norway to see how this non-EU member is finding ways of working with the bloc, all the while staying outside, even outside some parts of that single market. Let's take a look.
It's midday deep into the Arctic, and after a morning fishing expedition in glacial waters, these containers are overflowing with cod. Its final destination is the European Union, a union Norway is not a member of, but which is its largest client. 95% of Norway's products are destined for Western Europe, which consumes, among other things, Norway's high-quality fish. And for the most part, Norway can export it free from tariffs.
For
whitefish, there are a few types that have low tariffs, near 3.4%. But for the more important kinds of fish, like cod, haddock, coalfish, or halibut, there are no tariffs.
However, tariff barriers can increase when fish is transformed, like smoked salmon. That's because when it comes to fishing and agriculture, 10% of all the goods Norway sends to the EU every year, Norway remains outside Europe's single market. It negotiated those sectors separately in order to maintain greater control over its natural resources. In exchange, Norway contributes 1.8 billion euros to the EU every 5 years, almost as much as it would pay in if it were a member state. Except because it isn't one, the country gets no say when it comes to European regulations.
We are fully member of the single market, and we are fully member of Schengen. And I think we are one of the nations, even not as an EU member, then when it comes to implementing all the directives that are decided. So we like to stay close to the European Union, but of course, not being a member of the European Union.
A firm no to EU membership was established by 2 referendums in 1972 and 1994. Since then, Norway has adopted more than 6,000 regulations voted on by the European Union and more or less behaves like a member state. For example, this research center in Tromsø gets funding from Brussels, like a recent 9.5 million euro grant to study food consumption habits. This Greek researcher who works there has been living in Norway for 30 years.
Once you have a work contract, everything else becomes, it's very easy actually. It becomes very, very easy to arrange the rest.
Just like Norwegians who move to the EU, European workers are free to come to Norway. Whether it's students on Erasmus or those who come for jobs, Norway is open to all. But it has a clear preference for the best and brightest.
We want to attract the best candidate for the job, independent of ethnicity or nationality. So if it's a person from Spain that is better than a Norwegian, or scientists and scientific directors would actually prefer taking the Spanish instead of the Norwegian.
Nofima is one of Europe's biggest research centers. And while the EU sees this Scandinavian nation as a model student of integration, Norway prefers to keep one foot in and one foot out.
Okay, well, let's look a little more briefly at that EU citizens and migration question, as we see there are a number of different nationalities in Norway. Mr. von Weizsäcker, one solution we're hearing could be to put that cap on the amount of people the UK would allow in every year. Is that not the solution?
I would be very much in favor of basically grandfathering the rights that people would have had under EU legislation, both for citizens from the UK already in the rest of the EU and the other way around.
Of course.
And then there's a separate question. That's the question, how are we going to deal with people who will move from the UK to the EU and the other way around in the future?
Yes, of course.
And that's, of course, going to be part of the negotiation. And I would find it deeply regrettable if in the future we would end up with a very restrictive regime. But as you know, it's a hot potato politically, and it's one of the very much dishonest features of the Brexit campaign was at the time to say, well, immigration is out of control because of the EU. And when you looked at the numbers, it had very little to do with the EU and a lot to do with the rest of the world.
But David Davis has said that EU migration will carry on post-Brexit in very large numbers for the indefinite future. So that's completely dishonest, because they said that was going to completely change. But they'll just need a work permit, and they'll get one automatically if they find a job.
Ways. I mean, but another part is this whole single market question. I mean, we're hearing very vehemently from the UK that it doesn't want to be part of this single market, and that if the EU, the other 27, doesn't play nicely, it's threatening this race to the bottom in terms of taxes.
Theresa
and
May has said,
deregulations.
unless we have a good deal, we prefer no deal, and we will basically Brexit into a vacuum, i.e. the WTO schedules. That's the official government line.
So bad for the UK, but what about Scotland?
Terrible for both.
This is where the EU is certainly hearing from the UK government that it's rejecting the single market. It's not hearing it from much of the rest of the UK. The Scottish government, where Scotland voted unanimously across all council areas to remain within the EU, we've put forward a compromise proposal that would essentially see the whole of the UK remain within the EEA or the EFTA type framework. I accept Charles's point that that has been ruled out by the UK government, but I think it remains an option. I think once the negotiations start, we'll see a bit of the bluster falling away and a bit more of the pragmatism coming through. In the event that we can't see that, let me live close, then there's going to need to be a special situation for Northern Ireland, because the issue of the border with the Republic of Ireland is really serious. I was in Belfast a couple of weeks ago. It's a very sensitive time. And in Scotland, we want our democracy to be respected. I am a European citizen.
Scotland is saying it's going to put the Scottish referendum back to a vote. I mean, when we saw that independence referendum a few years ago, a lot of the people voting in it were EU citizens who had the right to vote because they were living and working in Scotland. If there's a Brexit, will they have the right to vote?
Well, it's an important point, because it really underlines the difference between British and Scottish nationalism. Our definition of Scottish is, do you live in Scotland? So in our independence referendum in 2014, all EU nationals had a right to vote. Well, some people were persuaded, some people weren't. That's democracy.
They wanted to stay in the EU, yeah.
But the European question was front and centre of the Scottish independence debate. It was quite clear the UK government line, and a number of people were persuaded by it, was that if you want to stay European, you need to stick with the UK.
And that would be...
We're now in a different situation.
And they'll switch.
Yeah.
Well, and
that's why Mrs May probably wants the referendum after Brexit, when they will be stripped of their rights to vote.
Well, this is where it's interesting that you guys have mentioned independence before I have. Our first option, truly, is to see the UK remain in some sort of European framework that will work for all of our citizens and indeed all of our European friends.
Okay.
If that's not possible, then there are differentiated outcomes that could be done for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, for Gibraltar, the sovereign bases on Cyprus even. The UK is a complicated thing. If we exhaust those options because of political intransigence in London, then we reserve our right to do what we need to do with the best interests of the people of Scotland.
Independence on Scotland, not on the immediate plan. But you also mentioned there the issue of Northern Ireland, and I mean, that is another question. Mr. von Weizsäcker, how do you feel? I mean, it would be an external border of the EU, this border with Northern Ireland, but it's also a border between Irish people and Irish people, between EU citizens and EU citizens.
Yes, it's a very tricky issue, and I mean, it's one of the many reasons why it's very unfortunate that we find ourselves in that situation. I think the way that the EU must look at this is that our primary objective is, of course, to negotiate Brexit in a way that assures the proper working of the Union in the future. But our secondary objective, of course, will have to be that we will continue, despite our deep regrets about Britain leaving the EU, we will continue to live in a good neighbourhood relationship. And these are the sort of issues that will have to be on the table.
So hard border or no hard border in Northern Ireland?
Well, I am very, very worried about that border because we've already seen Sinn Féin mobilising themselves here in the European Parliament. This is going to become a deeply sectarian issue in Northern Ireland. There will have to be a hard border. It will be the external border of the customs union, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, even if it's as frictionless as possible, which is the line of the British government, there will be border posts, and that is symbolic of a division which hasn't been there for more than 40 years. And I really fear that this is going to cause huge problems. And, of course, it's interesting that the Belfast agreements, the Good Friday agreements, also refer to the European Convention of Human Rights and the Council of Europe and the rights that accrue from that. It's clear that some of the Brexiteers, that will be the next target to pull out of the Council of Europe and the European Convention as well. So I do really fear for Ireland, and I'm a dual Irish-British citizen, and I really think this is one of the hot points, flashpoints of the Brexit negotiations.
Indeed, it seems like 2 years, a very short time to iron out all those issues. But for now, gentlemen, we're out of time as we await for that Article 50 to be triggered. Thanks indeed, though, for giving us your insights. Thanks also to you at home for having watched. To join us again after the news, of course, for more Talking Europe.